Hello all, and on behalf of Common Oceans Press, we'd like to welcome you to the launch event of The Red Deal, an Indigenous Action to Save Our Earth. We would first like to thank our host, Making Worlds Bookstore in Philadelphia, a city built on Lenape territory, and our co-sponsors at Red Media and The Red Nation. We are particularly excited to work with folks at Red Media to launch their imprint with Common Notions. Red Media is a media project by and for Indigenous people. We at Common Notions recognize that the struggle for autonomy and self-determination is a struggle for and over media as well. We believe we need more comrades organizing shoulder to shoulder to transform the settler, colonial, and capitalist logics of our media systems within and through book publishing and by any media necessary, and that our liberation is directly dependent on understanding and learning from each other's histories to build our collective future. We also believe that the common notions of our times bend toward freedom, but that takes organization and good relations. Common Notions publishes widely from the front lines to sustain movements for liberation. We are intergenerational and internationalist, abolitionist and anti-imperialist. We run our press collectively and practice the visionary, transformative democracy we seek in the world, in our office, and in all of our relations with each other, our authors, and our readers. We seek to bring our work out into the world in search of a good book and a free society. Common Notions is based both at the Interference Archive, an open access community-run social movement archive and social center in Brooklyn, New York, as well as here at Making Worlds, a cooperative bookstore and social center in Philadelphia. You can find more info about Common Notions and the Red Media imprint in the link in the chat, as well as connect to Red Media's Patreon page to access their podcast and events, and also directly support their work by becoming a monthly sustainer. The Red Deal, as well as many of our other books, such as the 2 volumes by the Abolition Collective, Abolishing Carceral Society and Making Abolitionist Worlds, Care Notes Collectives for Health Autonomy, We Want Freedom by freedom fighter and political prisoner Mumia Abu Jamal, who celebrates his 67th birthday this Saturday, among our other titles, are all available directly from Common Notions and fine independent bookstores like Making Worlds. Your support for collective, nonprofit, independent bookstore and publishing houses is greatly appreciated and politically, culturally, and economically vital to our work. You can also join our monthly sustainer programs for both Common Notions and Red Media, and both programs help ensure we can bring out more visionary and liberatory books and sustain the movements of our times. I'm about to turn things over to Melanie Yazzie, citizen of the Navajo Nation, co-founder of the Red Nation, president of the board of directors for Red Media, and tonight's moderator. Melanie will also introduce tonight's speakers. Reminder, we'll be looking for your comments and questions in the chats throughout the event, wherever you're tuning in from, and we're grateful for your contributions to a comradely and inspiring conversation tonight and in the days ahead. The Red Deal is not a book that ends when you finish reading it. In fact, reading the book is only the beginning. Its political project ends only when we mobilize ourselves and each other to make capitalism meet its inevitable demise. Colonialism is globally dismantled, and we all live in community and good relation with one another and the earth, from Turtle Island to Palestine. Many thanks and welcome all. And here's Melanie Yazzie.
Sorry, I'm muted. Total error. Let's start this over again. So yat eshik etushidina she Melanie Yazianisha Bilagana nishle ma adeshkijni bashis chin Bilagana dasha chero totsoni dashanala Behalga de nasha kot az nishle. I just introduced myself in the Navajo language. I greeted you as my relatives, particularly any of my Dene people who are listening in tonight, and all of our relations around the world who might be tuning in. I just wanted to give a little bit of a background information on who the Red Nation is, and give us a rundown for how we're going to move through tonight. I'll be moderating the session. I'm a co-founder of the Red Nation. The Red Nation is a grassroots Indigenous liberation organization that was founded in 2014. We advocate for the liberation of Native people and indeed all life on this planet from colonialism and capitalism. We do this through political education, direct action, advocacy, and different types of campaigns. And I think the Red Deal really represents who the Red Nation is and how we go about what we do. I also wanted to talk a little bit more about Red Media. Nikki, you did a fantastic introduction, but I wanted to go in just a little bit more to describe what Red Media is. The Red Deal, of course, is our very first publication, and Red Media is an imprint with common notions, but we're also a much larger and more ambitious media project, of course, run entirely for and by Indigenous people. So we produce writing and work according to our own intellectual traditions, not those imposed upon us by settler culture. We believe in Indigenous abundance and aim to inspire, caretake, and hold space for Indigenous writers by providing them a platform they may not otherwise have. Our mission is to nourish, sustain, and build Indigenous movements. We operate according to 4 principles. The first, Indigenousness is a way of relating. The second, by any media necessary, as Nikki said earlier. The third, we are not a minority. And I think that the conversation that my comrade, my Red Nation comrade and colleague, Red Media colleague, Ohikeo Marley and I had this morning on Democracy Now! If you missed it, you should check it out on the democracynow.com website or .org website, that we're not interested in Indigenous people being minorities anymore in media. We're interested in having an amplified voice, right? We want people to take us seriously. We're not window dressing for what is an otherwise left or environmental movement, right? And so this is really what we mean when we say we are not a minority. And finally, the last principle of Red Media is kill the capitalist in your head, right? We're not interested in commodifying Indigenous voices in media. We're really interested in producing work by and for Indigenous people that really nourishes our movements for liberation that we desperately need as we're facing a 30-year clock towards climate destruction, which of course is why we wrote the Red Deal in response to the Green New Deal. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Red Deal before we get into comments from my comrades who are here on the panel tonight. So the Red Deal began in late 2018, early 2019. Many of our comrades in the Red Nation sat down and we read the Green New Deal. Those of you who've read the Green New Deal know that it's quite short, the version that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced to Congress. And we had also read the Indigenous Environmental Network's response, asking for the Green New Deal to sort of strengthen its language about keeping it in the ground, right? This is language about keeping fossil fuels in the ground, coming from frontline Indigenous struggles against climate change and resource extraction. And we noticed that Indigenous people were mentioned twice in the Green New Deal in relationship to environmental racism, right? The disproportionate impact of resource extraction and pollution, which exacerbates, of course, climate change, and then also treaties. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to build off of the Green New Deal, but we thought that it really needed to be expanded and there needed to be a more comprehensive vision and a program for liberation and political action and change than what was offered. And so we decided to write the Red Deal. And for us, this was really important because Ocasio-Cortez actually states, right, that she got her start for her successful bid for Congress at Standing Rock during the No DAPL uprising of 2016 and early 2017. And so it was important for us to remind people in the Red Deal, right, that it's actually the movements themselves, Indigenous movements for decolonization and liberation, that create the possibility for change in the first place. It's not necessarily appealing to ruling class politicians. And so we wanted to take this movement-based orientation and we wanted to expand it and make a much more sort of comprehensive vision to find that alternative, right, to what's usually on offer when we're talking about climate justice. And the other thing that we wanted to do, there are 2 other things we wanted to do with the Red Deal. We wanted to indigenize, right? We wanted to indigenize this platform. Speaking about treaties and passing in the Green New Deal was a good start. But in fact, we talk with expertise, right? Because the conversation about treaties and the work on treaties in the history of Native American studies has been one of the very pillars. And it's always treaty rights. Being a treaty defender has always been at the center of Indigenous demands for decolonization and liberation. And so for us, treaties aren't just made between human beings. Treaties are also made with our other than human relatives, the earth, the water, the plants, right? The notion that water protectors and land defenders are acting as good relatives, right? That this was sort of the ethics behind what we wanted to do when we were indigenizing the Green New Deal. And the third thing is we were drawing really centrally from the 2011 Global Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth that was held in Cochabamba, Bolivia. And this was a counter summit in response to the April 2010 failure, right, of the COP15 climate summit in Copenhagen. And what the plurinational government of Bolivia wanted to do at that time, right, was to convene indigenous people through an explicitly anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist agenda. And so it was very indigenous, right? It was very anti-imperialist, and it was an anti-capitalist approach to how we should be reducing carbon emissions and how we should be addressing climate justice that didn't have anything to do with recentering the voices, right, of the global north countries that emit the most carbon, right, compared to global south, often offload the burden of that onto global south countries like Bolivia and also onto indigenous nations. But then also that those ruling class politicians, right, were trying and are continuing, Biden's climate summit was today, are continuing to try to find solutions that are consistent with maintaining the unequal relations of development and exploitation and extraction that make capitalism possible. So green capitalism is something that they rejected at the Cochabamba meeting of 2011, and it's something we wholesale reject as well in the Red Deal. And so these are some of the pillars of the Red Deal. One other thing that we wanted to do in the Red Deal was we really wanted to respond as indigenous people. Oftentimes I think the indigenous struggle is considered an analog for the environment, right? This idea that Native people are like one with nature, right? We hug trees, or, we have some sort of like mystical relation, like avatar like relationship. But we're very serious about, a revolutionary struggle and what it means to build a political program for that type of revolution. And as indigenous people, we think that our environmental justice struggles and our struggles for climate justice must also be responsive to the demands for abolition that are coming historically, right, from the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement for Black lives. And so the Red Nation, right, was founded in late 2014, right as Ferguson was popping off the next year. And so as an organization, we have grown up and our politics have developed alongside Black Lives Matter, right? Alongside demands to defund the police last year after George Floyd was murdered. And so we really center an abolitionist sort of formula in the Red Deal where we say, you need to divest from the institutions that cause the greatest harm on behalf of the state, right? Prisons, police, the military, and divesting from those institutions, we must reinvest in the common dignity of all, which means healing our bodies and healing our earth, which are the last two parts of the Red Deal. And what we're saying, what is the common dignity of all? It has to do with a program for healthcare, universal healthcare, right? Right now, it has to do with universal COVID-19 vaccines for free for everyone throughout the world, especially the global south. It has to do with free universal education. It has to do with free universal accessible transportation, right? It has to do with everyone deserving not just a house, but a home, right? Especially indigenous people. We are on our own homelands, yet we are dispossessed of our right to make home on our own homelands. And so this is what we talk about in the Red Deal. This is the larger vision. As we argue in the book, there is no shortage of resources. The resources that exist are simply hoarded by the ruling class, people like Joe Biden, right? And the multinational corporations that continue to plunder the earth. And we need to seize those resources and redistribute them as part of this larger vision, right? Part of this larger vision to address climate change, to have climate justice. And finally, before I turn it over to my comrades, we see land back. Land back is kind of the rallying cry right now for indigenous movements on the ground. That land back, actual land back, treaty lands especially, in the hands of indigenous people and indigenous nations to caretake and to steward those lands is the soundest environmental policy to stop climate disaster that the United States and all other settler nations could possibly be pursuing in this moment. We are 5% of the world's population, yet we caretake 80% of the world's biodiversity, including places like the Amazon rainforest, which is literally the lungs of the world. You can trust something we say in the Red Deal. You can trust indigenous people. We've been fighting this struggle against US imperialism and capitalism for 500 years. We have all of the knowledge and all of the experience, and we're already doing the work. It's simply not recognized or it's silenced in mainstream organizing. And so the Red Deal is an unapologetic and an emphatic sort of indigenous manifesto in a way about listen to us, right? Listen to us. We are the leaders already, especially Indigenous women on the front lines. So I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So what we're going to do is each of my other comrades on the panel, they're going to give 7 to 10 minutes of comments. Feel free to kind of introduce yourself in a more thorough way than I do. And then we're going to kind of go into a bit of a roundtable discussion, and then we'll wrap up the event. So thank you so much for being with us today. Elena, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Melanie. Uviagindi, my name is Elena Ortiz. I'm coming to you from Ogapoge in New Mexico. I'm from Okeawinge Pueblo, and I'd like to sort of jump off what Melanie was just saying. Since today is Earth Day, I want to talk a little bit about the chapter Healing Our Planet. And as Melanie pointed out, recent studies show that although the world's 370 million Indigenous peoples make up less than 5% of the total human population, traditional Indigenous territories encompass between 22 and 25% of the world's land surface, and they coincide with areas that hold 80 to 90% of the planet's biodiversity. Also, the greatest diversity of Indigenous groups coincides with the world's largest tropical forest and wilderness areas in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. And 11% of world's forest lands are legally owned by Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities. These forests, like the Amazon, are the lungs of the world, and they produce 20% of the oxygen in our Earth's atmosphere. So imagine what we would do without forests like the Amazon. Climate research also indicates that one of the most alarming aspects of the current environmental crisis is the loss of biodiversity. This loss affects human survival by interfering with crucial ecosystem maintenance, such as pollination and water purification. So when we have water protectors, they're protecting all of the water and all of the biodiversity, which also protects that water. Loss of biodiversity threatens the land, air, and water who are relatives that we share this world with. Of the 4 billion species that have evolved over the last 3.5 billion years, 99% have gone extinct. That rate of extinction has always been balanced by the evolution of new species. But there have been 5 exceptions to this pattern, 5 instances of mass extinction when the rate of species lost was so great that the biodiversity of the Earth was drastically reduced. These instances were caused by sudden cataclysmic events, such as massive volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, or dramatic sea level changes. Today, we are facing another great extinction, but this one is an event hastened by colonialism and capitalism. This book, The Red Deal, is about restoring balance to a world that's on fire in more ways than one. This book is about saving the Earth and why we're the only ones who can do it. Us, all of us, right now. This book is about power, the power of the people. Politicians can't do what only mass movements can do. Right now, we're on the road to extinction. And unless we all join together in the fight for decolonization, we will be complicit in hastening the end of all life on Earth. Neutrality is not an option. This book is also about love, the love we have for our ancestors who bequeathed to us this beautiful planet to caretake and honor. And it's about the love we bear for our relatives and the generations to come. It's incumbent upon us to leave them a world free from the destruction wrought by imperialism and capitalism. Our ancestors fought for the land. They fought for the right to live in peace and dignity on our Mother Earth. For millennia, our ancestors raised families, prayed, and loved upon this land. They sacrificed everything to ensure that we could do the same, and we can do no less for our children. This is our mandate. The Red Deal is our call to action, decolonization or extinction. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, Hyaha, and Sago. Those are beautiful, powerful words. I'm going to move on next to Jennifer Marley. And Go ahead, Jen.
Thank you, everybody, for having me here today. Ubiak Gindi, Sangitamu Navikema, Naokawe, Jennifer Marley, Navitewa, Kawa, Boa, Bohoke Winge Iwedi Umu. My name is Jennifer Marley, and I'm from the Pueblo of San Ildefonso. I joined the Red Nation when I was 18 years old, when it was just beginning. And I can't tell you how happy I am to see how far we've come. I love my comrades, and I'm so excited for the Red Deal. And so today, I'm just going to be talking a little bit about some of the portions of the book that I contributed to. And in particular, I'll be talking about policing gender violence and food sovereignty. So the reason, as Melanie briefly mentioned, that the Red Nation came into existence is to address border town violence. And border town violence refers to violence that happens in towns that are surrounded by Native nations. So it's not particularly referencing international borders. And we understand border town violence to be a continuation of frontier violence, where Native people are constantly pushed to the fringes on their own lands, beaten and brutalized and subjected to violence, be it by vigilantes and white supremacists or the police. And so in border towns, Native people are subject to constant criminalization, especially our unsheltered relatives. That people are seen as having a home, as not belonging or not having a home on their own land, which we entirely reject. And we understand that our unsheltered relatives need to be central to all of our organizing. When I first joined the Red Nation, we were calling for justice for Cowboy and Rabbit, two Diné men who were brutally beaten by some Hispano teens here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And since then, there have been multiple killings, again, be it by vigilantes or by the police. Our campaign calling for justice for L'Oreal Sinigini, a young Diné mother who was murdered by white police officer Austin Shipley in Winslow, Arizona, gained national traction. And this happened around the time Sandra Bland was also murdered. And so again, we always understand our struggle and the Red Nation to have developed in tandem with the call for justice for Black lives. We also emphasize that the police are first and foremost arbiters of settler colonial violence. They're here to protect the state. They're here to protect capital. We often point out that the same star badge these kind of early militias were given, which would later become the police force, were designated as such, particularly to kill natives, to clear the land, and to capture runaway enslaved Africans. So it's inherent, the role of the police has never been about protection for anybody. It's been about augmenting the wealth of settlers and clearing the land of Native people. We understand the military to be an extension of this, and that there is this inherent relationship between the police, the military, and these white settler militias, which we've seen become more and more out and proud in public over the past year, right? And so it must be understood that the U.S. is inherently a settler colonial project, and the role of the police and the military is to sustain this settler colonial project. The term military and prison industrial complex is one we use throughout this book to describe this relationship. And what we call for is a divestment from these institutions, from policing, from the prison industrial complex, from the military, and reinvestment into our communities to meet our basic needs, right? Housing, healthcare, education, transportation. And we have a quote in here that says something to the effect of, what if the military had to have a bake sale to keep its doors open instead of, a shelter for battered women or a language program for Indigenous students? What if we had our needs met and instead institutions like the military, had to go through these means of trying to fund themselves? And so something I emphasize always is that abolition is a possibility when you think about divestment, and historically divestment has worked, whether we're talking about South African apartheid, the boycott, sanctions, and divestment campaign to free Palestine, and even the calls that were made by land and water protectors during No DAPL, calling for financial institutions to divest from the funding of the pipeline. And we know that these are effective. We know that the police are always linked to imperialism and militarization abroad. We know that the military exported many of its tactics and its brutality that was developed during the course of the Indian Wars to the rest of the world, to violently overthrow democratically elected leaders and to destroy democratic processes in the name of more exploitation, more resource extraction. And to this day, we know that the police exchange tactics and technology with the Israeli government, with the Israeli Defense Forces, and that the same technologies that were used on land and water protectors at Standing Rock were actually developed by brutalizing Palestinian people and displacing them from their land. So we understand that our struggles are linked in that way. And that's why we talk about Palestine so much, because the removal of Palestinian people from their lands is settler colonialism in action. And they understand that, right? They don't want to face the fate that we have as Indigenous people here. And so we give our undying love and solidarity to the Palestinian liberation struggle. And within the structure of policing, there's a number of institutions that carry out this violent imperialist and settler colonial project here. ICE and CBP, right? We know that when the US displaces people in the global South, South America and Mexico, for example, in the name of resource extraction, we know that the U.S. military is the #1 polluter in the world, causing quote unquote natural disasters, which I'd really say are, military and imperialist created disasters. This disproportionately impacts our relatives in the global South. And this contributes to the quote unquote crisis of migration, right? When really it's just a crisis of imperialism and capitalism. And so when people are forced from their lands and their homes and they seek refuge here, they're again subject to being brutalized by ICE and CBP and being profiled by police. Child Protective Services has historically been an entity that's existed to remove Native children from their families, going back to the industrial boarding school era. And it continues today with Child Protective Services disproportionately taking children from Native mothers for the crime of being poor, right? Not because they're unfit caretakers, but because they are, again, subject to poverty because of the way settler colonial violence operates. How much time do I have? Okay, I'm about to finish up. So gendered violence has always been an attribute of the settler colonial project. We know that early trading posts not only served as a trading post for things like pelts or jewelry, but human beings, women and children. We know that the sex trade has had horrible implications for us here in North America historically. And to this day, gender violence continues to be a tool of genocide against Native people. And that's why Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women is a campaign and a movement that has picked up so much steam, because Native women continue to suffer from the highest rates of all types of violence here in the U.S. And elsewhere. I have some statistics. So we know that 75% of deaths for Native youth happen violently. We know that more than 60% of Native youth have been recently exposed to violence. We know that 1 in 2 Native women will experience sexual assault in her lifetime. That's half of all Indigenous women. And we know that transgender relatives experience even higher rates of violence, with 67% of Native transgender people saying that they've experienced sexual assault at one point in their lifetime. And 73% of all Native women saying that they'd experienced intimate partner violence. And so we call explicitly for the liberation of Native women, of LGBTQ relatives, because we have always been at the heart of this struggle. Settler colonial projects specifically targeted our women and LGBTQ relatives because they represented alternate governance systems. It wasn't because gender violence is inherent necessarily to Europeans, but because they were trying to destroy our governments. They were trying to destroy our economic systems, because it was women and queer people who were in power. And to this day, they continue to be subject to the most intense rates of violence here and abroad. And so lastly, I want to talk about food sovereignty. Our economies, our governments were land-based, and we had subsistence economies, which allowed for no wealthy or poor class to form. The Red Deal uses the examples of Pueblo feast days and giveaways and throw days, where, and of course, many other tribes have traditions of giveaways, and this was to ensure that no wealthy class could form. It was a literal distribution of wealth. It was a literal distribution of sustenance. And so we know that historically we've had these alternative governance systems, and we still have remnants of them. And it's not far-fetched to see them revived to replace the violence of capitalism and exploitation of settler colonialism. And so we call for a food sovereignty movement. We call for our lands to be remediated, and we call for the institutions responsible for polluting our lands to remediate them, to put those resources that we know they hoard into remediating our lands, so that we can again live sustainably, so that we can sustain, from the land, and revive our communal economies. And so I think it went a little over time. I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Jen, I don't care if you went over time. You helped write the book. That's what we're here to do. Thank you so much for clearly laying out the institutions of violence that we're trying to divest from, right? Or that we're proposing, or in some ways demanding, I would say, in the Red Deal, that we divest from. I think oftentimes people don't know that state apprehension of Indigenous children is actually one of the primary forms of carcerality that Indigenous people face. In a place like Canada, for example, there are 3 times more Indigenous children in the custody of the state than there was at the height of the residential school system. So that's a really important addition. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Comrade Justine, to take it away.
Ubiakindi, Sengitamu, Nabikema, Na Otoa Kawe, Katbovi, Na On Americana Kawe, Justine Tiba, Katbo Winge, Tetsuge Winge, Akamo Pueblo, Wediomu. Hello, my name is Justine Tiba. I'm from the Pueblos of Santa Clara, Tsuki, and Acoma. I am a member of the Red Nation. I've been a member since 2018, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the Red Deal. Wow, following up Jen's presentation. And Elena's got me a little emotional. And all of the Red Deal gets me emotional. There are multiple points in this book where I am moved to tears. The Red Deal for me it's basically a life-affirming document. Anything that you have believed about the future of Indigenous people is laid out in this book. Just last night, I was scrolling through Facebook and I saw one of my Resi homeboys post. He said, "Natives should be running our own countries." And I immediately commented, "Get the Red Deal. That's exactly what it lays out. Please get it." And that's what I really appreciate about the Red Deal, is that it clearly lays out, it lays clear imperialism, it lays clear settler colonialism, and it makes clear what it means to be an Indigenous person living within the most imperialist force that's ever existed. In the Red Deal, we go over, it covers just about everything. It goes over everything. The perpetual crises that we face are a direct and deliberate result of capitalism and colonialism and imperialism, right? And so we must confront those forces. And so, like, that's what the Red Deal lays out. Excuse me, I'm really nervous. But for me, the Red Deal has always, or the Red Nation has always confronted these things. The Red Nation, I didn't even know about nuclear colonialism until I got to the Red Nation, which is like, oh God. So I'm from Tewa Lands. Los Alamos labs were made in Tewa Lands. The nuclear bomb was created in our sacred mountains. And in the Red Deal, we go specifically in, I believe it's part 2, Heal Our Planet, where we talk about food sovereignty and agriculture and stuff. We talk about how sovereignty and food sovereignty is one of the what is one of our means to liberation. Oh geez, I feel like I'm messing up. Okay, here we go.
Justine,
I'm like so nervous. Okay.
go off on Lanel.
Okay. But okay, so why I brought up Lanel, right, was because like what the Red Deal does is it advocates for us to hold accountable these imperial forces. It forces us to hold accountable the United States. Well, the entire climate justice movement is these liberals today had a climate justice summit, and they aren't holding like the US accountable. Oh geez, I'm so sorry. I'm like very okay. Oh God. Okay, so I guess what I'm trying to talk about here is that the Red Deal makes a clear plan for achieving Native liberation and achieving a future for all of us. In the Red Deal, we clearly lay out that we only have 2 options, right? Decolonization or extinction. And those are our only 2 options. The Red Deal, and I quote, says, "Now more than ever, we need people to understand that we have to actively create a world we want to live in. Man-made disasters like climate change and the unnecessary spread of COVID-19 are not manifestations of the earth healing itself. Such deadly events are direct results of the actions of those who pillage the earth, the ruling class. These capitalists view the earth as a resource to be exploited instead of a relative to be protected. Wherever you are, create campaigns that pinpoint the central role of capitalism in creating this suffering and the need to dismantle capitalism for the sake of our common future." And so unapologetically, the Red Deal and the Red Nation call out these forces that are actively destroying the earth, capitalism and colonialism. And so, like, what does it mean? What does the future mean for Indigenous people, for a Tewa person who comes from lands where our sacred mountains are devastated with nuclear radiation? You know, the pots, the clay that we harvest for our pots is contaminated with radiation. The evergreens that we use in our dances are contaminated with radiation. The deer that we hunt are contaminated with radiation. In fact, in my pueblo, Santa Clara, there's a cap on how many deer you can hunt and consume a year because of how contaminated they are. And so when we look to be self-sustaining, the reality is there are many Indigenous nations that don't have the don't have the ability to even become sustaining because of the devastation from the U.S. settler colonial project. And the Red Deal unapologetically calls out to hold these imperial forces accountable. And by accountable, that means that they are in a climate debt to us. They owe us these things. And so that's like why what Jen was talking a lot about divestment from these institutions and reinvesting in all of these things, investing in healthcare, investing in housing, investing in what we're going to consider green jobs, is the cleanup of the cleanup of our lands that are devastated. We have to imagine a future where many worlds fit, and we lay out. It's a clear plan that lays out the steps that we need to take to achieve decolonization, and much of it comes from reinstating correct relations. And it's as simple as reinstating correct relations and being a good relative and being a good ancestor, and imagining and fighting for a dignified future. And then it's an imagination of what the future can be. It is affirmation to our existence, my existence as an Indigenous person, and the truth to what we need to do. We're citizens of a land that has yet to be brought into existence, but nonetheless, I'm so sorry, I'm a mess right now. I am very nervous because I just got done reading all this. I've read it before, I've read it again, and all I can really do is just speak from the heart and really just talk about like how the Red Deal is going to save our planet, and how we are going, and what we're going to do to be good relatives and good ancestors to a future that we might never achieve. The United States is the most colonial imperialist force in the entire world. It is the world's biggest polluter. We have the United States has over 800 military bases all over the world, and it has a chokehold on not only Indigenous nations here in the United States, but in the global South and the rest of the world. And what the Red Deal does is it lays clear what we need to do and what we need to do to dismantle this imperial force, and that is reinstating Indigenous rights back to, or not Indigenous rights, it's reinstating stewardship of the land to Indigenous people. It's reinstating land back to Indigenous people, and it's affirmation to our long-standing traditions of knowledge and science and beliefs of our lands, and it offers us a way to regain control of our lands and our ability to caretake for the entire world. It begins a path for us to begin healing in a structural way, because we need to turn back the tide of imperialism in this age of capitalism, because the United States was never inevitable. Capitalism was never inevitable. And this is a document that affirms that reality, that it doesn't have to be this way. And so I'm sorry it was a little messy, but I'm going to pass it on to my next comrade.
You're a rock star, Justine. You did great. I just want folks to know, like, I think sometimes people have this perception of the Red Nation based on all of the stuff that happens on social media. Like, the Red Nation is real people. We are led by like working class Native people, especially women and LGBTQ folks like Justine, right? We're all trying to learn together. Like, the fact that you just read this book for the first time all the way through in this way, like, the nerves come from the fact that we're real people, you know, who are writing from this kind of experience. And it is very emotional. It's very emotional, not because we're like Native people and we have too many feelings, you know, not that like racist concept of emotion, but it's emotional because we have worked so hard on this project. I mean, like, there are literal blood, sweat, and tears. Like, there are prayers that have gone into, like, I brought this into a ceremony to pray on it kind of prayers that have gone into the Red Deal. And if nothing else, it's important, I think, for people to understand that the Red Deal for us, it's a prayer. It's a prayer that we carry, that prayer, right, to protect all of our relations, to ensure a future for life on this planet, and that we refuse to stop walking that red road. Like, that's what the Red Deal represents to us. And we are so damn proud to have this book and this program and this vision out in the world, this unapologetically Indigenous vision. And Justine, like, you always remind us of this. When you speak from the heart, that's your power in the Red Nation. And like, thank you so much for your powerful, beautiful words. Okay. All right. So we're going to move on to Nick next to provide some comments, and then we're going to try to have a discussion with each other.
Hamantakiapi, Nape Chuzapi Chante Washte. My name is Nick Estes. I am also a co-founder of the Red Nation and have been with the organization since it was founded in 2014. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the kind of internationalist approach of the Red Deal and why when we wrote this, we really had more than just the United States and its consumption-based economy in mind, and thinking about holistically, what does it mean to be good relatives, not to white supremacist nations like the United States or white supremacist empires like the United States, but to the rest of the world. And I think, as Justine had pointed out in her talk previously, that we have a special obligation as people who are living within the belly of the beast, so to speak. Those of us who are of the United States, but not entirely of the United States, if that makes sense. And I want to begin by talking about two climate summits that happened today that really represent two divergent paths that we are on right now. The first is the one that was convened by Joe Biden in the leadership summit that happened today. And the second one was convened by the plurinational state of Bolivia, where social movements and heads of state gathered to offer an alternative to the climate imperialism being espoused by people such as Joe Biden. And what we're really confronting, and I think Melanie pointed this out at the beginning, is what we're really confronting is challenging the idea that somehow the United States should be leading by example for the rest of the world, when in fact the United States needs to be paying its debts to the rest of the world, paying what we conclude the Red Deal on is paying its climate debts. So thinking about what role do Indigenous people play in this current energy or in this current transition scenario, especially those in the global north, because we didn't write this document to dictate to the rest of the world how they should run their movements or the things that they should advocate for. But in fact, we listened deeply about their concerns and decided how we can write something from in the belly of the beast that would make the most impact. And so I want to kind of position Indigenous movements within a broader framework. So if we think about ongoing emissions, carbon emissions into the atmosphere, the United States and Canada combined put out about 1.7 billion metric tons of carbon emission each year, which is quite a bit. And currently, Indigenous people, Indigenous movements within the United States and Canada are challenging about 27% of those emission standards. Anything ranging from carbon projects or fossil fuel projects such as the Dakota Access Pipeline to the now defeated Keystone XL pipeline. And so far, that means about 27%. That means about 500 or half a billion metric tons of carbon emissions are currently in question because indigenous movements are the most confrontational arm of the environmental justice movement right now. So even though in places like the United States, we're less than 1% of the total population, or in places like Canada, I think the percentage is around 5%, we play an outsized role in doing our part in making sure that the United States isn't the number, isn't the leading hegemon for climate catastrophe, right? So if we think about this in terms of the Biden administration's recent proposal to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, which we can all agree is a step in the right direction. But the World Bank recently issued a report suggesting that 3 billion tons of metals and minerals like copper and lithium will be required by 2050 for wind, solar, and geothermal power to meet the base target of the Paris Climate Agreement. And so in places like the United States, this means maintaining levels of consumption, energy consumption, right? There's no plan to like limit those energy consumptions. And in fact, according to Biden's plan, he wants to transition the federal fleet into the federal vehicle fleet into an electric vehicle fleet. Right. So pretty soon, according to the green energy revolution that Biden is proposing, migrants won't be running from fossil fuel vehicles, fossil fuel powered vehicles or gasoline powered vehicles. They will be running from electric vehicles, probably made by companies like Tesla. Right. So this is the future that Biden has in store for us right now, and the current neoliberal plan that he has for the rest of the planet. This also includes plans that Senator Elizabeth Warren has called for, which includes greening the military. So not only will human rights abuses be committed with a carbon footprint, they will now be committed with the satisfaction of they'll be carbon neutral emissions or carbon neutral human rights violations. So where does this leave us in this particular moment? So oftentimes we think that the only two options that we have in the United States are the options between Democrats and Republicans, when we know that both Democrats and Republicans have both expanded and continued the U.S. war on terror, or waging economic wars through sanctions and blockades against other countries that present an alternative to the neoliberal capitalist order. So increasingly, we know that the Venezuelan crisis in oil production is linked to North America. So under Obama's administration, during shortly after the beginning of the Great Recession in 2008, there commenced a fracking revolution, right? And under Obama's energy policy, which was an all of the above on energy policy, which later became, American energy independence, it meant developing domestic oil. So under Obama's two terms of presidency, domestic oil production increased 88%, right? And this was specifically targeted at a country like Venezuela, which has the world's largest oil reserves, right? It was a way to quote unquote wean the U.S. economy from oil imported like countries such as Venezuela or even Iran. So what happened under Obama was a tightening of sanctions against a country like Venezuela. But it wasn't just to get at Venezuela. It was also to get at countries like Cuba, right? Where we now know that the Mas family, an infamous billionaire Cuban American clan, is responsible for which is responsible for the subversive and legislative attacks on Cuba in the U.S. Congress. It has accumulated much of its wealth from fossil fuel extraction on indigenous lands, and in fact had been one of the major funders of the Dakota Access Pipeline. So here we have an anti-Cuban, anti-communist legislative bloc that is also profiting from the plundering of indigenous lands for domestic oil production, right? And the reason why isn't just because, you know, somehow they just hate Cubans or they hate Venezuelans. It's because Cuba and Venezuela, as we argue in the Red Deal, actually present a real viable political alternative to neoliberalism and climate change. And as we talk today, you know, as Melanie had mentioned in her introduction, Bolivia is currently hosting its own climate summit. And the reason why Biden actually is hosting his climate summit today is because traditionally or historically since 2009, Bolivia has kept April 22nd or Earth Day as its kind of day to celebrate the rights of Mother Earth. But since the U.S.-backed coup against the Bolivian government through the party MAS and the president Evo Morales, the coup government under Áñez actually decided to pull Bolivia from that slot. And so in its place, the United States or Joe Biden has held his own summit, right? To basically fashion his wares, which in my estimation is really just, you know, it's really just an expo for Tesla and the kind of green energy solutions that are happening, the green energy solutions that are happening in the United States. And so where this puts us as indigenous peoples, you know, in Arizona, where Biden overwhelmingly won the native vote, the Forest Service in the coming months could actually designate an Apache sacred site, also known as Oak Flat, as a sacrifice zone for this green energy revolution that he proposes. An Australian mining company called Rio Tinto is looking into this site to create one of the world's largest copper mines, which no doubt will supply 1/5 of the United States copper needs. This means this will be the copper that will be wiring the electric vehicles, that will be wiring the solar panels as part of, you know, Biden's $2 trillion green energy transition plan. So again, we haven't moved away from the Obama era and the Trump era policies of sacrificing indigenous lands for the expense of the economy itself, and nor, as we know now, nor are we moving away from the kind of imperialist relationship that the United States has with other countries to get at what it calls Blinken, the Secretary of State, calls strategic minerals, which include things like lithium and copper. So this extractive relationship hasn't changed. And so if this is the case of climate change and a just transition, it's a geopolitical kind of maneuver for the United States to capture and to have a monopoly on these so-called green technologies or renewable technologies, then our response as people in the belly of the beast also needs to be international. And we can't transition away from fossil fuels at the expense of indigenous people or the rest of the world. And so where we look to is we look to things such as the 2010 Cochabamba Accords, where there convened social movements that brought into being a covenant, a sort of treaty, a deal like we are advocating here, a deal between, or an agreement between, the humble people of the earth and not the rich and powerful, a deal that advocates for eco-socialism, ecofeminism, and decolonization fundamentally. And so when we talk about land back in the context, and I think my comrades before made a good case for land back, we're not only talking about land back for indigenous people within the domestic kind of territory of the United States. We're also talking about, as Justine mentioned, land back for all the 800 overseas military bases that violate the sovereignty and deny self-determination to millions, in places such as Guantanamo Bay, Okinawa, Korea, Guam, Hawaii, Philippines, Iraq, Egypt, Afghanistan, Puerto Rico, El Salvador, Honduras, Panama, and so many other places the United States occupies. That's what we mean by just relations. And we also boost the call, or support the call, to decolonize the atmosphere, to restore to oppressed nations and developing countries the atmospheric space that is occupied that is colonized by the first world greenhouse gas emissions. This means the decolonization of the atmosphere through the reduction and absorption of first world emissions, primarily the United States. A technology transfer. These green technologies, as we see within the vaccine nationalism that's taking place, where the United States covets patent technology, such as for vaccines that could save people's lives because it wants to turn a profit. We see the same solution or the same problem happening with the transfer of green renewable technologies, such as solar panels and rechargeable batteries. We also advocate for paying the climate debt, first and foremost. First world countries, especially the United States, must assume all adaptation debt related to the impacts of climate change on developing countries by providing them the means to prevent, minimize, and deal with damages arising from their excessive emissions. So this final point, think about this in terms of what Biden is advocating in this current policy framework, and also think about what is being advocated in things such as the Green New Deal. Is there room or is there space or conversations about the United States actually paying its fair share of the climate debt? And the only way that's going to happen, it's probably not going to happen through a domestic movement in the United States. It's only probably going to happen through international cooperation to redistribute the ill-gotten wealth and ill-gotten power of this imperialist nation state. And that's what we mean by anti-imperialism and climate change, is that fundamentally those who are most responsible cannot be in charge of the transition. It has to come from those most infected and most impacted. And we include in that conversation the indigenous people and all people of color who have been affected by U.S. colonialism and imperialism within its borders, as well as those outside of it. So thank you very much. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you for that comprehensive breakdown on the approach to imperialism that we offer, the critique, and then also the political program to undo U.S. imperialism, which is the greatest enemy to revolution across the globe, and certainly to Indigenous liberation. So based on some of what you all talked about, Justine, you broached the topic of green jobs, right? The idea or the conversation around just transition when it comes to climate justice is really huge, right? How do we create? There's always this question, right, that's thrown back at people who propose things like the Red Deal, like, well, how are you going to create jobs if you kill in energy industry, for example? And I think we actually talk about this pretty extensively, especially in the Heal Our Planet part of the Red Deal. Like, what is a job? What is labor, right? And what is the vision around the politics of labor that we're advocating for in what we're proposing in the Red Deal? Anyone can take this, or all of you, it'd be great.
Cleanup. You can make, twice as many, if not more, jobs that are available now via the energy industry and extractivist industry with cleanup initiatives. That's my short answer. Yep, that's my short answer.
I also think we need to get away from the idea that human beings need to work 40 to 80 hours a week in order to sustain lives. Like, that's a capitalist structure and subsistence living that is doing what we have to do to feed ourselves and our families and take care of the land and take care of our community. That's an indigenous way of looking at it. And sometimes of the year you work more than others, and sometimes of the year are devoted to taking care of your community and your relatives. This idea that we all have to kill ourselves to get to 65 with enough in the bank to retire is not indigenous. It's capitalist, and we need to kill the capitalist in all of our heads in order to move forward and live a life that our ancestors lived, and want to have time for ceremony, want to have time for games, and we want to have time for fun. We want to have time to be creative, and all of that can't just end when you turn 16 or 18 and need to go to work or go to college. Those things need to be sustained throughout our lives. So 40-hour weeks, that's the first thing that's got to go. And then jobs. There's a lot of jobs, as Jen said, cleanup, but also taking care of our community and being there for our relatives, so that we can follow through with abolition and not have to deal with strangers in our communities with guns killing people. Like, if we caretake our communities and we caretake our land, that's a job. Those are jobs.
I think Melanie talks about this, so you should answer this question, but I'll just say that caretaking is a form of labor, specifically as part of indigenous communities, whether it's caretaking land through the label of, or the identity of, a water protector or land defender or air defender. And that's protecting resources that we all need to live. Often that's gendered labor that often goes unrecognized and unpaid, but nonetheless is vital to the continuation on life on this planet. And we see throughout the hemisphere that just in this chat, for example, you have people who are demonizing and criminalizing actual indigenous people who are trying to defend land and protect our communities. So this is something that that indigenous people face on a daily basis, whether, in places like Colombia, for example, many indigenous land defenders are frequently assassinated. In places like Honduras, we have the legacy and the heroism of somebody such as Beta Caceres and others. So in many ways, that has been a kind of a political label and attribute of indigenous caretaking and feature of caretaking. But it's not just limited to indigenous people. And that includes, like at places like Standing Rock, or even at Line 3, if one walked into those camps, they automatically became a water protector, whether or not they were indigenous.
Yeah, something we kind of spitballing off of what Nick just said, it's not like, I said this before, and I think Oak Lake Writers Society wrote this in the comments here during this event. Indigenous people are already doing the work. It's just not recognized as work, right? When you're protecting the water, when you're praying at the water, when you're going to front lines, when you're quitting your 9-to-5 job, the 40-hour-a-week job, right? And you're going up to Standing Rock to help cook for people. That is all labor, right? But it's not paid, and it's not considered work in a capitalist society. So the work of motherhood, for example, right? Motherhood is actual labor. Usually the labor of caretaking, we've seen a lot of caretakers they're the heroes of the pandemic, the nurses, right? The parents, the people who have kept people safe and kept people alive. Mutual aid workers are caretakers, right? That these are the heroes of the pandemic. That work is not paid, right? So the concept that somehow some sort of like revolutionary kind of proposal for listening to indigenous people, building off of our traditions of science and technology and political economy, that somehow that won't translate into quote unquote real jobs that will help, create some sort of like economic stability for people. It's such BS, right? It's such BS because so many people, I don't know what the statistic is, are already doing that work. It's just simply uncompensated, and it's not recognized as labor in and of itself. And most of those people are women and LGBTQ2 folks. A lot of them are also youth, right? A lot of them are criminalized for the labor that they do. Caretaking is highly criminalized, and it's highly discriminated against in the United States. And so what if we actually elevated caretakers? What if we actually paid caretakers like, a living wage? What if we actually reformulated our society around caretaking labor and what that looks like, and we restructured ourselves according to that? I think that's something that we consider really seriously in the Red Deal, and we talk about that. And I think it's one of the areas in the book that, we can sort of push on more, that we don't necessarily develop a really strong plan in the book itself. But I think it's a really fruitful and incredible area for development moving forward out of the Red Deal. So I also wanted to ask folks a question. I didn't really say this. I didn't describe the four principles, right, of the Red Deal. So those four principles are slightly different, but they hinge on pretty much one major sort of concept, or one major proposal for how we go about an action-based program like the one that we propose in the Red Deal, right, to stop climate change. And we talk a lot about movements, right? Politicians can't do what only mass movements can do. And so let's talk a little bit more about movements. Like, what are the movements we're talking about, right, in the Red Deal? What do we mean by politicians can't do what only mass movements can do? Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about what is the role of movements in this vision that we're setting out in the Red Deal.
I think like one like current and prime example is the conviction of Derek Chauvin, and that was solidified only through the Black Lives Matter movement. It was the movement itself that ensured that he would be convicted on all 3 counts. That's my short answer. I'm gonna stay with short answers because I'm really nervous.
But I mean, just to pick up off of where Justine, made that point, it was only because of people in the streets that a conviction was possible, right? And it probably wouldn't have been possible maybe even a year ago. Well, a year before that, I should say, 2 years ago. But that wasn't also the demands of people in the streets. It wasn't just about a conviction. It was a much more comprehensive revolutionary demand calling for the abolition through the defunding of police and carceral institutions. So I think even in the sense that there are mass movements, their aspirations in this current moment often can't get captured by the institutions of the state or even politicians themselves. So somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and I know there's like valid criticisms of her, but she's just a politician, and the Green New Deal is a climate policy that didn't really necessarily arise from a grassroots base. And so what's in contrast to what the Green New Deal is and what the Red Deal is that we actually went through a process of writing this that wasn't just the 5 of us. It wasn't even just 10 of us. It was dozens and dozens of people who actually put time and energy into this, that weren't just like academics, who weren't necessarily people involved as activists per se, but people who were in communities and at listening sessions that we had conducted and part of events. And in fact, one of the questions in the chat was like about what are some local struggles. The Red Deal actually arose both from the anti-police violence movement here in Albuquerque and in the Southwest against border town violence and vigilante violence, as well as the anti-fracking campaigns led by Pueblo and Dene women and youth to protect Chaco Canyon. So that's really the origin stories of this particular book and where it came from.
Yeah, we talk a lot about people power, right, in the introduction to the Red Deal, that, I think what we often see in mainstream, Nick, you laid this out really well in the way you were talking about Biden's climate summit, right? Like in mainstream climate justice work, we see a lot of this kind of like, what did George Manuel say, crying on the man, crying on the shoulder of the man who stole your land, appealing to ruling class politicians, voting hard, voting real hard to get that change to happen at that particular level. And in the Red Deal, where we understand that somebody like AOC, right, or even Deb Haaland, I talked about this earlier this morning on Democracy Now!, that Deb Haaland herself and kind of her rise to this position, this historic position she now holds as the Secretary of Interior, that actually could not have happened had Indigenous movements not been growing and literally like pulsating for the last decade, and particularly Indigenous women who are often not allowed to serve in leadership roles in our own Indigenous nations, but certainly not in sort of mainstream political structures. Right, that our role historically, but also I think especially over the last decade of Indigenous struggle, grassroots struggle, has been in that realm. It's been in the movement itself, where Indigenous women have led. And so you have someone like Deb Haaland, right, I think, who has really emerged out of this kind of uprising, this kind of rising up of Indigenous women's leadership in these movements around environmental justice and around climate justice. And so, she is a result of people power, right? And so we talk a lot about how people power is what we need, what we want to foster, what we want to nourish in the Red Deal. That's the source of our power, right? But the source of our power isn't someone representing us in government necessarily, because those people don't have any power unless there's a movement behind them. And so we understand that we need to have the people power of a movement behind us. I mean, the Red Nation isn't really a movement, right? We're a small organization that helps, that does our best to galvanize and to build and to always, support the movements as they're unfolding organically on the ground. But that's what we're talking about in the Red Deal. We're organizers with and of movements, but that those movements need to be on a scale that's really large. And I think that's the interpretation of people power that we have. I wanted to ask another question. You brought this up too, Justine, about the future, right? Like, what is the future that we envision? What is the new world? So, in the past few months in the Red Nation, we, as Indigenous people, we get real yoded a lot talking about prophecy and, like, what does the future hold? And we were talking kind of at the new year between 2020 and 2021 about how we feel in our bones, that we're emerging into some sort of new era, as not just as the Red Nation, right, but as humanity. Like, all of our relations on Earth are entering into a new era, and for Diné people, like, the way we understand history, of course, right, is the emergence from kind of old worlds into new worlds. And that oftentimes we leave behind that which has caused damage in the old world as we emerge into the new world. And that the new world is a place that will be better, right? Not just for us, but for all life. And so what is this new world that we're envisioning in the Red Deal? What does that look like to you as somebody who co-authored it and as an Indigenous person? Or what should we leave behind? That might be another good topic.
I'll talk a little bit about this. It's real fresh on my mind because I recently interviewed a Pueblo elder about activism and Pueblo resistance, because our legacy of resistance, particularly political resistance, is often erased. And what I like to leave behind is a movement, like a real movement, not just an organization. Like, I want us to leave behind something that people can pick up and continue to push forward themselves. I really would love to leave behind stories. Lately I kind of see my role shifting, and I really resonate with the idea of the storyteller. There's a quote from Leslie Marmon Silko, a Pueblo scholar, and she says, "In the end, stories are all we have." And even the Red Deal itself is like a type of storytelling. It's a history of our people. It's a history of resistance, and and it does that even without containing personal narratives necessarily, although it does have a couple. And so I just want people to know that we did fight, that this did happen. And I want to leave something so substantial that it can never be erased from history. It can never be thrown to the side or, diminished enough that it's not significant anymore. For better or worse, I hope that people can take up what we've started and, galvanize it into real revolution someday.
I love that, Jen. The stories, because I feel like all my life I've been told stories, and it wasn't until I hit a certain age that I began to really apply them to life. And so to build on that, I want the new ancestors, the generations yet to come, to know that the women and the LGBTQ2 rose up and reclaimed their places in leadership and refused to tolerate the continued colonization of our communities by these structures that were brought by Europeans when they invaded this country. And among those are male leadership, solely male leadership, and the gender binary, and transphobia and homophobia. Those were not indigenous to our lands. And I want it to be known that we stood up and said, we will not take it anymore. And trans people and LGBTQ women always to the front and center. And what Melanie said, Ko'odeb couldn't even be a leader in her own community, but she's the Secretary of the Interior. And like her or not, that's a position that as a woman, she fought 10 times harder than anyone else in the world had to fight. So women to the front, LGBTQ relatives to the front, recognition that we refused to sit down. And it wasn't, there's a quote, it's not about getting a seat at the table. It's about getting the table the heck off our land.
Women to the front, men to the kitchen. Oh, those are really wholesome. I think about, I think what is really going to be really cool about the Red Deal is that like the future children and the future ancestors are going to know that there was Indians out here being this balls out, really laying down the law, really telling it how it is without apology, without any sort of compromises, that we deserve a dignified life and that we continue to. I would give anything to hear the conversations of Tewa revolutionaries when the Pueblo Revolt was going on, and I just leaving behind the Red Deal and just knowing that there was really rad Indigenous people who made these connections, not only to like their own like material like surroundings, but also were able to connect everything like globally, that we look to our relatives in the South to do these things, and that there's a global alliance for them to look forward to, and for them to continue to build to. And yeah, it's really wholesome to know that there's going to be kids out there who are going to read this and who are going to be just completely instilled with like confidence that their thoughts that they have been thinking their entire lives are the truth, even if it is, natives should be our own countries, or like what happened to all of our land, all these questions that we have when we're kids are, affirmed in this document.
Yeah, I taught this. Well, I didn't really teach it. I had a graduate seminar I taught on the politics of care and caretaking this past semester at UNM in the American Studies Department. I assigned the Red Deal, and so I got really incredible feedback from my students a couple of weeks ago when we read this. And one of my students, she said that she shared it with her younger sister, who's a teenager, and that the way that we talk about things and the type of, the language that we use is very direct in the Red Deal. We don't really beat around the bush. We're not liberals. we don't put window dressing. We don't sugarcoat things, right? Because the, extinction, it's like kind of a thing you can't really sugarcoat. You just got to tackle it head on. You have to be really honest and brave about it, and about tackling it. But she said that her teenage sister really loved that about the book because she felt like it spoke to how she thinks about things in her own head, but she almost never sees reflected in the political discourse that is available to her, whether it's through news or television or social media. My student, the older sister of this teenager who said this, she's like, I feel like the Red Deal is like the unconscious of Gen Z, right? Of the Zoomer generation, which is like She said it's cynically anti-capitalist, but what's interesting about the Red Deal is that it's not cynical, right? The Red Deal is not cynical, even though we clearly outline, decolonization or extinction. Like that's a serious, serious call to action, right? We are very serious about what it's going to take to stop, right, extinction, to ensure that there's a future for life on this planet, that there is like deep hope, right? And there's profound optimism that's also built into the Red Deal that she found incredibly refreshing, but that she felt like she could actually believe in and she could actually trust. And I would say that comes from, for me, like a very Indigenous perspective on decolonization as a future-oriented project, but it's a very Indigenous feminist kind of orientation, which the Red Nation has always been, right? That it's Native women who have led these movements who have taught me, that our lives don't belong to us in the here and now. Our lives belong to future generations. And so what are we doing here today in the here and now to ensure that there is life, a way to thrive and abundance for the future generations, not only of our own people, right, but for all our relations on this planet. And that really is the heart and soul of the Red Deal. And I think, personally, it comes from the voice of the Native women leaders like LaDonna Brapel Allard, who passed on a couple of weeks ago, or like Carrie Dan, who passed on in January, always in my head reminding me, and I think reminding the Red Nation who we are and why we do this work. So I think it's a very serious but a very hopeful document, but that hope is grounded in reality and not like crazy kind of conspiracy theories like anti-vaxxers and QAnon traffic in. So we have a few minutes left. I'm just going to give you one question from the audience, and then I'm going to remind folks of Patreon and some other things that are upcoming for the Red Nation. So we have a question about, my sister asked this question. She's in the audience. So the Red Deal, read it, love it, and now what? How do we activate? It's a very action-based program. So how do you answer that question? So where do we go after we read the Red Deal?
I think this is very much a movement-oriented doc. I think typically in like academic spaces, academics are always supposed to be about nuance and asking questions, but we're never encouraged to ever provide solutions. And so this isn't just something, this is a solution. This is action. Like these are policy, broader kind of policy shifts that need to be made. So it is not something that should just be taught in the classroom for intellectual debate or question or nuance. It's actually not really meant for the classroom space itself, even though you should teach it. It's really meant for to be in the hand of movement-oriented people. And I think this question, really it depends on the scale, right? So in one sense, we could apply a Red Deal kind of framework to the local city of Albuquerque and the movement to abolish the Albuquerque Police Department as being fundamentally tied to environmental justice struggles as they relate to fracking and the contamination of water and aquifers in this territory, because both are toxicities to poor people, not just Indigenous people, but everyone. And so that would be like a small scale kind of framework, but thinking like large at a large kind of structural level, as I talked about earlier about anti-imperialism and ending, the US's unilateral sanction of 1/3 of humanity. That requires a different kind of a scale, a movement that goes beyond just one nation and kind of one municipality or even one Indigenous nation. And it requires a kind of scale of international cooperation and pushback against capital that we may not have seen, but I do believe is brewing slowly and kind of simmering to the surface at this moment in time.
So whenever I talk about the Red Deal, I always tell people that this was written like kind of as a toolbox, for lack of a better term. It can be taken up as a platform for tribal leaders, for city leaders, for people like Deb Haaland. She could take up the Red Deal as a platform. It can be, but first and foremost, it should be used as I mean, I'm hesitant to say like a guide, but we did write it specifically with, you know, at the end of each section, here's what you can do. Here's specifically what you can do. Is this an issue in your community? Does this section speak to you? Here's what you can do, you know, whether it's holding teach-ins or actions or galvanizing support from your community. You know, these are the things that the Red Deal calls for. Maybe it's creating a divestment campaign. Maybe it's, you know, something like feeding people, meeting people's needs, but all with, you know, the idea of it being a part of a mass movement eventually, right? It's really actually very versatile in the way it can be used at all levels. It can be used, you know, obviously to empower one individual, but it can be used to actually provide guidance for people looking to organize and engage in movement building. And so that's what I always remind people. And I also remind people that it was written by the people that it's for. It had the input of everybody from elders to youth, to community members, you know, those not even necessarily affiliated with Red Nation. It really contains the voices of, you know, those who it's meant to speak to. So I'll say that.
Elena, do you have any final comments about this question? And then we'll go to you, Justine.
I think Nick and Jen really covered a lot of it. And what's been going through my mind right now is just understanding and reflection. One of the other great points is what creates crisis cannot solve it. Or in other words, the great Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So it's up to us, it's up to the people, and however you can do it in whatever way you can. Just start one foot in front of the other.
Yeah, I think the Red Deal does a great job of putting us all on the same page as Nick and Jen laid out. And I just wanted to end by reading the closing paragraph. I think it sums all of it up very good. In closing, we hope these words move you to act. In each day, the Red Nation, we study, theorize, enact, and experiment with everything we have laid out here in the Red Deal. We govern ourselves and our relations according to one simple philosophy: being a good relative. Be a good relative. We are, as a collective, an experiment in practicing infrastructures of Indigenous world-making premise on this central edict. We don't always get it right, but we refuse to give up because we carry the dreams of our ancestors in our hearts. These dreams will never steer us wrong, and they will never steer you wrong. The struggle to remember our humanity through our love for the earth will define the future for all. Join us. We are waiting for you. We welcome you, and we are ready to act. Oh God.
Oh God.
If that wasn't my first time reading it, I would have absolutely lost it.
That's beautiful right there. Again, I think that's a prayer. It gives me a really good feeling in my heart. We're at time for the event. We've gone over a little bit. Sorry we couldn't get to all of the audience questions. Thank you so much for joining us again. I just want to remind everyone to check us out on Patreon, patreon.com, Red Media. It used to be the Red Nation, but now it's Red Media. So patreon.com, look up Red Media. Go to Common Notions page. I think that they're putting the links up in the comments again if you want to purchase the book. We also provide different tiers on our Patreon for purchasing the book. You get kind of cool swag. Justine has been working really hard on it. I want to give a special shout out to Kylie Guy, who's our program director in Red Media. Kylie and Justine have been working their Indigenous pancake butts off and getting all of the stuff out around Red Deal promo. You all have been amazing. You all have done an amazing job around this. Just a special shout out. I wanted to remind people that we have one podcast that's sponsored by the Red Nation, but several others. But actually, it's sponsored by Red Media. It's the Red Nation podcast. I'm the host of Elena and I are the host of Red Power Hour, which is now sort of a sub-series of the Red Nation podcast. We were formerly kind of our own independent podcast, but we now went back into the fold of the Red Nation podcast main feed. So check out our podcast. You can find us anywhere online where you can find podcasts. And finally, I just wanted to plug another book that some of us co-authored, Nick, myself, and some friends of the Red Nation, David Correa and Jennifer Nez-Dennett-Dale, as well as two very important people in the history of the Red Nation, Brandon Benally and Red Milla Cody, all contributed to a book that will be coming out in early May. It's called Red Nation Rising: From Border Town Violence to Native Liberation. We are having our book launch event for that book next Wednesday, April 28th. April 28th, same time, 5 p.m. Mountain Time. You can look that up on our Facebook, pretty much on any of the social media, any of Red Nation's social media. And then you can view that live on Facebook Live or again in our YouTube channel. And I just want to give a special shout out to the fact that we are #1 in sales on Amazon right now in colonialism and post-colonialism, #1 in Native American studies, or Native Americans, or whatever it's called, in demographic studies, #5 in communism and socialism, only outpaced, for example, by the Communist Manifesto. It's hard to beat that one. And that we're #2 behind Bill Gates. We will surpass you at some point, Bill Gates, in the environmental policy section. So thank you so much to everyone who's purchased the book. We really hope it feels that we're ending this in a good way, right? And that it feels like something really powerful that you can carry forward into your spaces. And like we said at the end of the book, the Red Nation is here. We're waiting for you, and we welcome you into the struggle. Thank you so much for joining us.